So, welcome everyone to Meru Health Graduates webinar. Today we're talking about a very interesting topic and something that is familiar to you from the Meru Health program, but that you will get a lot more information on today. So the heart rate variability biofeedback practices. And today's presenter is our expert on the topic, Kirstin Aschbacher. And to introduce her briefly, if you put the next slide, Kirstin, so I can read. So she has her PhD in clinical psychology, and she's the Senior Director of Health Data Science at Meru Health. And actually, she has built the most recent version of the Meru Health's heart rate variability biofeedback algorithm. And she serves as the behavior strategist in redesigning portions of our experience in the app. She is also an associate professor at the University of California, and she has over 60 peer-reviewed scientific publications in mind-body health. And last but not least, she's a mother of 2 young children and practices HRV-B herself, and has also taught her mom to practice HRV-B. Very impressive. And just a quick disclaimer. So this information is not intended or implied to be a substitute for medical advice. It is provided for educational purposes only. So always consider seeking the advice of your physician before starting any new treatments, which might interact with your personal medical conditions. And briefly, before I pass it on to Kirstin, I just wanted to say that we have a Q&A at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom if you have any, and feel free to use the chat. And you will also receive the recording of this webinar after we are done. All right, passing it over to Kirstin.
Thank you. Well, hi, everybody. This is very exciting to be talking to all of you Meru graduates. And just a quick overview of some of the topics we're going to touch on today. So we'll start with just, what is HRV? And in particular, talk a little bit about the resting HRV assessments that you've done versus the biofeedback sessions. I know we get a lot of questions about the metrics, so I'll try to explain that briefly, and then we can go more into detail if you have more questions in the Q&A. I want to talk about the benefits for you of continuing to do your HRV-B now that you've graduated. I'll touch a little bit on this question, like how and why does doing HRV-B impact the way that you feel? And last, just talk a little bit about sort of next level HRV-B, like what are some ways that you can continue to deepen that practice by incorporating mindfulness or incorporating some CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy skills that you've learned through the program. And I'll even tell you a little bit about how you can incorporate it into cravings management. Okay, so let's see. What is heart rate variability? Well, so if we take an electrocardiogram that's used by your cardiologist, it's going to show a pattern that looks sort of like this. And each of those little spikes is sort of when you're when you have a heartbeat. And so what a lot of devices will do is basically try to measure the distance in time between 2 heartbeats in milliseconds. And that's really what this picture is showing. And most of the measures that you end up seeing as some kind of summary of your HRV are starting with that series of basically what's the distance in time between 2 heartbeats. And in general, the heart does not beat like a metronome. It doesn't beat super regularly. It actually has a lot of variation between each of those heartbeats. And what we've learned from many studies is more variation is good. And it basically means the heart can respond very flexibly to all kinds of situations, right? If you have to suddenly run, or you have to do, respond to threats or things in your environment, your heart needs to be able to respond very flexibly, to beat faster if necessary, to bring blood to different organs in your body. And so variation is good. Now, of course, using a wearable like you've done, that's not directly measuring your heart in the same way they do with an ECG in the cardiologist's office. Instead, a wearable, the way it works is it uses a technology that's called photoplethysmography, or PPG. And basically what that's measuring is changes in blood volume in these like small blood vessels that are in your ear. And, you can see actually there's a lot of small blood vessels in the ear. So that's one of the reasons it's a good place to get this measurement from. Okay, so now let's just talk about what are the metrics. So one myth I kind of want to debunk. Some people get confused. There are these resting assessments, and then there are the biofeedback sessions, but they're really not the same thing. And the metrics that we use to understand them are not the same. Let's see, I see there's might be some issue with the screen share. So Maya, just let me know if you can't see the slides. At any rate, so resting kind of looks more like this graph on top, and then biofeedback is shown on the bottom. And so what I'm showing here is on the x-axis, this is time. So this is in seconds. And then on the y-axis, this is your heart rate. And this is what the data looks like when I see it after it comes off of your device. And so, just kind of qualitatively, one thing you can see is that in resting, there are little patterns and there's a lot of variation in the heart rate, but it's kind of smaller, fast variation. And then when you do biofeedback, you see this big kind of undulating wave start. And that's what we want. That's why biofeedback is done at a slower pace than what you normally breathe at. And that's where a lot of the science comes from about why it's beneficial. Let's see. Okay. So, what does your HRV mean? So we get this question a lot, and it is something we're working to improve on. Ultimately, we'd like to have a lot more information on the website that would provide some of these answers. HRV is really an umbrella concept. So a lot of people get confused and think that it's just like one number or one measure, but think of it more like it's a concept about variability in your heart rate. And there are many metrics that you can use to measure different aspects of this umbrella concept. And they each metric is going to reflect something a little bit different about your nervous system and how it's working. So in the resting assessment, the main metric that you see when it says your HRV is actually something called RMSSD. And that is, it's basically based on the mathematical formula. It's the root mean square of successive differences. But what it's telling you about is fast variations between one heartbeat and the next. And higher is better. Okay, so during biofeedback though, we're intentionally slowing our breath down and we're generating the biggest undulations we can. And so we need a different metric for that. We don't use RMSSD anymore. And there we're calling that now the resonance score. So some of you may have seen the latest version of the pacer has the different colors. And when you're kind of in low resonance, it's more of a gray. And then when you're in higher resonance, it turns a deeper blue. And so the pacer color is showing you basically a resonance score in the moment. And I'll show you, let's see. So here's kind of a good way to visualize that resonance score. So this is actually fake data that I generated to make it look like a real person's data. But so in the beginning, this is kind of what a resting wave would look like. So there's still some changes because people are still breathing while they're resting, but they're breathing in a different way. And then when you slow down your breath to this pace, you're able to take advantage of some kind of physiologic ways that your body works to get these really large undulating waves. And that is exactly what we're going for. And then your resonance score, you can think of it, I've kind of drawn it here in pink on the waveform. So that's basically, it's like the height of this undulating wave. You want it to be as tall as possible, because what that means is you're making, as you inhale, you're making your heart beat faster. So it's getting faster, bump, 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 bump. And then as you exhale, your heart is naturally slowing down. And this is due to the vagus nerve input, the sort of parasympathetic nervous system input. So then as you exhale, your heart rate is getting slower and it's going down. And getting this big undulating wave is basically you using your breath to sort of push your heart rate to go fast and then go slow. Let's see. So we do also spend time to make sure that our metrics are valid. So when we show you a resonance score, it's not just sort of something we invented and said, this is great, but I've done some work to try to validate that it's meaningful and useful. And we do that by, there's a couple ways. One is I'm showing this graph, a correlation with kind of the gold standard way that this would be measured in research. And basically the graph shows that they're very, very similar. So they're very highly correlated, which means, because here this is the Pearson correlation, and a Pearson correlation of 0.95 is very close to 1. 1 is the highest correlation value you can have. And so it's saying essentially it's very, very close to the research gold standard. Now, we can't use the exact same measure because we're doing this real time. And in research, they've already got all the data and they're looking back at it. So we have to use a slightly different algorithm, but the result we get is going to reflect the same fundamental thing that's being measured in these research studies that validate that HRV biofeedback is good for you in various ways. And we also have a paper that is almost published now about our own data showing that people who are getting better resonance within our program, that's predictive of better clinical outcomes. Okay, so how can you benefit from continuing HRV biofeedback? So I think as a clinical psychologist, it's just so important at your stage to maintain your gains. Like, you guys are sort of a special group of people who I see as especially resilient because you made it through the whole program. And that takes a lot of kind of dedication and discipline. And then you've even come back today for more information. So I know that you're capable of building this into a longer term habit. And it is really important to basically maintain the gains you have, because a number of people will eventually relapse and re-experience some form of depression or anxiety. Life isn't going to stop being stressful. So the triggers will be there. And it's a good time to think about building the tools, your sort of resilience toolbox. Whoops, okay, sorry. So I know that there are so many apps and blogs that promise that, they have different tools for you to manage stress and, enhance your well-being. And those range from everything from mindfulness, meditation, supplements, fast breathing, slow breathing, yoga breathing, right? So there's so many options to choose from. And I want to talk a little bit about why HRV-B is special. So, or is it special? And in my opinion, the answer is yes, it is special. And it's not that these other techniques aren't also useful. And, really in the best case, you can combine them. But there is something very special about HRV-B, and I hope by the end of this presentation, you get a better sense of what that is. I see there is a question about if you can improve your HRV score, will that help you feel better? And I think broadly, I'd say for most people on average in the data, yes, the answer is yes. But hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll have a bit more nuanced information about why. So one thing I want to say is there's a lot of strong research support around heart rate variability biofeedback. So here what I'm showing you is there's a researcher who has combined like 58 higher quality studies all together. That's what a meta-analysis is. And so by combining all these different studies done by all kinds of researchers in different places with different kinds of, study samples, right? We can get a much bigger picture of like, how well does this actually work and what kinds of problems can it work best for? And there isn't this kind of evidence for many of the things that are advertised. So that's really important. And basically across all these studies, this researcher looked to see, what does HRV-B really help with and what does it not help so much with? And so I pasted in the table of actual data, and I'm just, for those of you who like data, I'm focusing on the column on the far right that's called without outliers because it's the most conservative. So if something has a significant or very low, very small p-value there, that means it really makes a difference. And in essence, what it tells me is that it has shown to be quite helpful in reducing symptoms of depression. It improves emotion regulation. So we probably need to pause there and say, what is emotion regulation? I'll get through the list and then maybe I'll try to answer that. It helps with cravings. So for example, food and alcohol cravings. It helps with what scientists call cognition, but that has to do with like how well you can focus and focusing your attention on a task or making plans, remembering things or being able to multitask. Sorry, just to answer the question, HRV-B, the B in HRV-B is biofeedback. So that's my shorthand. Okay, HRV-B also helps with pain and somatic symptoms, like symptoms in your body. It helps with cardiovascular health. There's kind of this borderline effect. Maybe it helps with tummy troubles, gastrointestinal health, and not in this study, but in other studies I've seen, it seems likely that it might help with asthma. And there's maybe one study about menopause. So if we talk about emotion regulation, what that means to me is, let's say I'm in a difficult conversation with my partner, and my partner is saying some things that are really pretty triggering for me, but I'm trying really hard not to react, to get extra frustrated, or to let my tone of voice get sharp, because then the whole conversation might kind of go downhill at that point. So emotion regulation is kind of that, a muscle in my brain, so to speak, that lets me control how I'm feeling. The fact that actually I'm a little irritated and I'm kind of triggered, and it helps me kind of manage that. I can be aware of it, but then I can manage it so I can try to, speak back in a way that is ultimately in the greater good of, resolving this conflict, solving the problem, instead of getting carried away in how, I'm feeling upset or triggered. I hope that makes sense. So, as someone, I guess I want to highlight that, typical HRV biofeedback care, it could cost, $300 an hour for a face-to-face session. So normally clinicians, psychotherapists get certified in HRV-B, they buy equipment, you go to their office and they hook you up to the equipment and you get, maybe a 30-minute session. But then that's it. You can't necessarily practice as easily at home. And, you're paying for a lot of money for each session, and you have to drive there, and there's gas. And so one of the things I think is really important and innovative about Meru is that you now have this device and you have the ability to practice at home whenever you want. So that in some ways it's a real advantage, and it's basically free to you now that you've graduated. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn from our heart about how we respond to stress. And this graph, so in this graph, we were sort of testing out our device, and the participant, we first asked them to do HRV-B or biofeedback. And that's this large waveform that you see in navy blue. And then we asked them to watch this kind of neutral videos, like about cooking, not very emotional. So it's kind of like a resting assessment, but with a little bit of a distraction task. And that you can see now the rhythms are quite small, a little more irregular, and that's in the middle in teal. And then we asked them to go back to doing the biofeedback, but meanwhile, they had to do sort of a stress task, like a mentally stressful task at the same time. And that's in red. And so what you can see is that your heart responds to stress, right? And even when you're trying to do something else, like do biofeedback, if you're being mentally stressed at the same time, it's going to really affect your heart. And if you look at kind of how it affects it, you can see that this person just isn't able to really maintain this nice regular pattern at the same time as they're coping with a stressor. And to me, what was super fascinating is we also tried asking everybody in the program to tell us how they were feeling, how stressed they were feeling right before they started the practice. And I really don't see much of a relationship between what people are telling me and the data. But if we actually give them a stress task like this in the slide and we measure it, then we really see that stress has a very, a noticeable effect. And so it's interesting because maybe I think what it says is we don't always know how affected we are by stress. Sometimes what we're willing to acknowledge, especially to other people, about how stressed we feel is not the same as what our bodies are experiencing. And from that perspective, it's really important that we also be treating the body and helping the body know how to respond to stress, because we're not always aware of it. Stress not only is affecting your heart, it's also affecting your brain. And if you look at sort of leading neuroscientists who study this, what they basically tell you is it makes your brain prone, it makes you prone to react very quickly instead of responding. And that's what I think HRV-B is most helpful with, is giving you that capability to respond instead of react. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit briefly about like why I do HRV-B, or why I made sure that my mom knows how to do it. There's this way that people talk about therapy and depression or anxiety as though it's like in your head. And that kind of sounds like it's not real and you should just make yourself feel differently, and if you can't, then there's something wrong with you. And so I want to debunk that, first of all. If you're starting to feel stressed or maybe depressed or anxious, it's not in your head, it's in your brain, right? And your brain is in your body. So it's just as much a part of you and a part of your physical body as if you had diabetes and maybe your pancreas didn't function, in a normal way. But with mental health, we tend to talk about it differently. And we sort of talk about it like you just need to, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and feel better. And so I think HRV-B plays a really important role as a kind of adjunctive or companion to therapy, because it is really directly treating the body in a way that therapy doesn't. Okay, so before I came to Meru, I had a career where I was a professor at UCSF, and I focused on stress and the body's response to stress, and then mental health. And so there's a couple things from that part of my life, that research, that I want to share, because they really, it's part of the sort of story of how I ended up here and why I think HRV biofeedback is important, and maybe important for you in building this like resilience toolkit, in avoiding going back into the place you're at when you started the program. So it may feel like a detour, but I think it will come full circle. So this was now, 10 years ago or something, that I published a paper while at UCSF, and we showed on, as part of this team that included Alyssa Epple, who wrote the telomere effect, you may know. So we were able to show that people in the study who had greater reactivity to stress, it predicted whether their depressive symptoms would increase over the next year. And the way we looked at stress reactivity, we did ask people like how they were feeling before and after this stress task we gave them in a lab. So everybody kind of got the same standardized stress task. And we did ask them how they were feeling before and after. But we also drew blood and looked at all kinds of, biological measurements, and we measured HRV during this whole stress task. So we could get kind of a holistic picture of what happens. And what's important to note there is that stress reactivity, it can predict depression. And if that means that if we learn tools to manage our stress reactivity, it suggests we might prevent depression. Now, about 10 years later, at the beginning of this year, I published a study that's kind of a follow-up to that original one. And I asked the question, well, if we can predict who gets worse, can we predict who gets better and who doesn't, when they go through treatment? And so in a nutshell, yes, we did. We studied this group of women and children who had experienced a lot of trauma, and they were going through basically a world-renowned therapy to target women and children with a lot of trauma. And this therapy had already been shown to be really effective. There are 5 published randomized controlled trials about it showing that it's effective. It's been ongoing at SF General for, 20 years or more, led by Dr. Alicia Lieberman. She's the clinician who originally developed this. But even so, in this really effective therapy with some of the best therapists that I've met, there's maybe about 1/3 of women and children who don't get better. And that's not uncommon. It's not uncommon that even with really good therapies that generally work and really good clinicians, that, some segment, maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of people don't get better. And here in this study, what was so interesting to me, you might think that, how much trauma they'd experienced or child adversity, that would be the best predictor of whether or not they would get better with therapy. But it wasn't. Better than that was actually these biomarkers that I had looked at based on the knowledge from that first study. And so I looked at these markers of immune system kind of balance and activation, and we were able to predict basically who had a response to the treatment, who got better and who didn't. And, that's hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around, but let me tell you why I think that is. So when your body is in a dysregulated state, and if your nervous system is constantly activated, you're also activating your immune system. Your immune system is communicating with your brain. And so then now you have some level of low-grade inflammation in your brain. And what that does is it keeps you from being as good at learning new things, building new connections. And, when you go through the Meru program, you're learning a lot of things, right? You're learning new tools. You may be learning like Dear Man or different sort of acronyms. And all of that, you need a sort of healthy brain to accept that information, integrate it into your life, figure out how you apply it. So the moral of the story, in my eyes, is that therapy is important, but it's not enough. We also need to add this more mind-body component to calm down our nervous systems and deactivate some of the inflammation that otherwise can keep us from getting better. And so from my perspective, that's where HRV-B really comes in. So this diagram just kind of shows you that really your whole body, you have your nerves and your nervous system connecting all the organs and tissues of your body with your brain, and they're sending information in both directions. And so your brain is hearing about the state of your body, and it is responding to that in a way that directly contributes to to depression. And with HRV-Biofeedback, part of what we can do is start to help our nervous system rebalance so that as you go through your daily life and you're experiencing different stressors, it's not keeping you kind of in this chronically activated or sort of inflamed state. Okay, so now the next section I want to talk about is like, how and why does HRV-B affect how you feel? So one metaphor I like is HRV-B is kind of like brain training or physical therapy. So imagine if you have like an old ankle injury and you want to exercise, but your ankle's kind of weak, right? You can't, perform, maybe you're in a class, like I used to like to go to dance classes pre-pandemic. So I can't maybe perform all these movements in the way that the teacher is showing me because of my ankle. HRV-B is like physical therapy. It's like, maybe you are trying to learn from your therapist, they're trying to teach you different techniques, but it's not always easy to figure out how you actually skillfully apply them in your own life, with your own family members and friends. And HRV-B, kind of like physical therapy, gives you back that strength and strategy and that balance to do the performance or the exercise you're trying to do. HRV-B is kind of helping you rebalance your nervous system so that you can do the new skills and things you're striving for that you're learning about with your therapist. So the idea is actually that you will still feel some of the stress you're under. It's not that you're totally numbed out, but you can manage it. So this is a super sciencey slide, and I couldn't figure out a way to make it any simpler. It's inspired by Dr. Mara Mather, who's an HRV-B neuroscience researcher. But this, for those of you who really want the mechanistic explanation, would be the answer of like, why does this kind of breathing, which people sometimes call resonant breathing, that we do with HRV-B, why would it help my depression? So when you breathe in and out at this frequency that we call the resonant frequency, that's basically the pacer that you're following. What it does is it generates these extra large heart rate waves, which you've seen now in a bunch of graphs. And along with that, there are also waves that get generated in your blood pressure. And that signals certain nerves that talk to your brain. So your brain is getting this message, like the large waves in your heart rate are causing neurons or whatever to fire in your brain so that message is getting to your brain. And over time, some of the neuroscience research shows that it actually changes the activation of some of the parts of the brain or circuits that help you control emotions, that help you manage stress. Now, one way that I try to integrate this into my own life is to make it a habit. Because, you can do something once or twice, but it's really not going to change your brain if you just do it once or twice. if I want to rewire, sort of hack into my own brain and rewire my nervous system, then I think you really need to integrate it into your life as a daily practice. And that's why at Meru, we're not emphasizing the long sessions, we're emphasizing short sessions that you can actually fit into your life. I mean, I have 2 young children, and so I don't have an hour a day to meditate, but I can find, 5 or 10 minutes. And, I want to encourage you that it's okay if it's boring, and it's okay if there's some days when you don't get into resonance, or even if you get that message that your device is reconnecting, or if your attention wanders and you stop breathing with the pacer, like that's all okay. It's just part of the process. But what really matters is, building that habit and just sticking with it. And then ultimately over time, you're kind of rebalancing your nervous system. You're actually making changes in your brain, and then that helps you respond instead of react. So now I'll talk a little bit about kind of like next level HRV biofeedback. So for some of you who are graduates and you may be you've gotten comfortable with it, but you might be a little bored at times, these are some things you can use to kind of keep it fresh for yourself. And if you're not feeling like it's easy, if you're still struggling with it, please don't feel obligated to do these things. They're not necessary. So, some people have asked me, well, what's really the difference between HRV-B and mindfulness? Well, the first is I've recorded my own heart rate doing mindfulness, and I can tell you it doesn't look the same as when you do HRV-B. You don't get those same big waves. So HRV-B is different because it's intentionally targeting, creating a physiologic response in the heart, in the blood pressure that our latest science suggests is probably critical to getting the effects in the brain that we're looking for, that help you feel better. But you can practice mindfulness while you're doing HRV biofeedback. And so things you might do is, notice how you feel when your resonance falls. So for a lot of people, when they're watching the pacer and it's telling them they're in low resonance or the color goes gray, that it can be kind of frustrating. It can make you feel worried. And the practice of mindfulness is to just take a little bit of distance from that and notice, oh, I'm getting irritated with the device. I'm starting to worry about my health. Just noticing those thoughts and noticing that they are thoughts, and they might be true, they might be not true. And noticing the stories in your mind. So sometimes when we're going through an experience like that, there can be this kind of story that spins off. Like, I don't know, I had COVID at one point. And then when I was doing biofeedback after COVID, I was in really low resonance. And, I might notice that there's a story in my mind, like, does this mean that I'm going to end up having respiratory problems? Am I going to be one of these people who has long COVID? I thought that maybe this was going to protect me, but it didn't. And, worries, anxieties, or frustrations. And mindfulness is the practice of seeing that and seeing your mind like run away and stopping it, bringing it back, say, okay, yeah, I'm supposed to be, let me focus on my breath. Let me notice that I'm having a lot of judgments, and let me just recommit to why I'm here, why I'm doing this. Next, here's another way that you can kind of up-level your HRV-B practice. And I would only do this if you feel pretty comfortable, changing your breath in different ways. If you're a person who tends to get lightheaded or feels pain or anything like that, then, this is probably not for you, and that's totally fine. So I do think that in the morning, if you start with a little bit of fast breathing right before you do the HRV-B, I don't have any research evidence to give you. This is kind of my own anecdotal experience and knowledge put together. But when I recorded myself doing the fast breathing, I think it's toning your nervous system in a slightly different way. So sometimes I like to do that before HRV-B, and you can kind of Google some good yoga videos on YouTube that would teach you this, but there's a fast breathing technique where you kind of go like, right? So if you Google kind of that fast breathing technique, you can do that for a minute and hold your breath at the top. It basically is going to increase your heart rate and then it'll go back down. Another thing that you can do during your HRV-B practice is alternating your nostrils, where you would breathe in through your right nostril and then hold and then breathe out through your left nostril. And then on the next, as the pacer says, inhale, you would breathe in through the left and then out through the right. So you can do this with the pacer. And sometimes it helps if my attention is really all over the place and I'm really like ruminating about something, then I might want to do this because I'm kind of forced to focus on having to switch nostrils, and it's bringing a lot more feeling that I can concentrate on. And also I think it's very likely or possible that it could affect the two sides of your brain in interesting ways. So anecdotally, most people feel like this kind of is calming and balancing as an effect. And then this is the last slide, and then I just want to open to questions and answer some of the things in your chat. But to me, it's really interesting that there's some good evidence that HRV-B can help with managing cravings. And the studies have mostly focused on alcohol, but there's also one on food cravings that had a really large effect. And there's even a separate meta-analysis published to look at the combined effect of all of those studies. So the way I would recommend that you might put this into your life, let's say that, you've gained some pandemic pounds, as most of us have, and we're trying to sort of manage cravings, maybe not exactly diet, but just try to avoid overdoing it. I would combine HRV-B with some other skills, because the way I think of HRV-B is that it's going to strengthen your ability to have your behavior match your intention, right? Like your intention is, when I go to this, like my kid's party, I'm not going to eat the cupcake at the birthday party, but then the behavior could be something else. Maybe I am going to eat that cupcake, right? So oftentimes we set these intentions for ourselves and, our behavior doesn't end up aligning with our intention. Now, it's okay if we just changed our mind and decide it looked like a great cupcake, I want to eat it, that's fine. But if you're trying to really work on being able to follow through on your intentions and feel like you have the control to do that, I think HRV-B is helping build that muscle. But the things I would then combine it with for cravings management specifically have to do, so there's urge surfing. That's a good skill. Urge surfing looks like this. So it's the evening and I'm feeling kind of snacky and I'm having this urge to go, eat some leftover pumpkin pie or something. I say to myself, well, okay, if I end up eating pumpkin pie, that's okay. But I'm going to practice surfing this urge. And that means for the next 10 minutes, I'm not going to actually give in to the urge. I'm going to surf it in a kind of mindful way. Like I'm just going to notice. I'm not going to get upset with myself for having these thoughts, and I'm not going to attach. I'm just going to notice, okay, I'm thinking about pumpkin pie. All right, what was I doing? Oh yeah, I was trying to do this thing. And keep doing that for, 10, 15 minutes. That's urge surfing. And then, if you're still craving the pumpkin pie, eat it. But again, this is the muscle of practicing in your life that you don't have to give in to every urge, and you can respond, or you can choose which urges you give into or don't. Another one is, I would call it trigger management. So, like don't have the snacks and the things that you're worried about right in front of you, put them far away where they're not cueing you, so you don't have to use the muscle of self-control as much, okay? Because any muscle kind of wears out when we have to use it over and over again, and your cognitive muscles are kind of the same way. You get fatigue, you get cognitive fatigue. So you only get so much self-control. Don't, try to avoid having those visual triggers. And again, I think that that practice pairs really well with HRV-B. Having self-compassion around it, instead of making it like shame and blame. And then the last thing I'll say that, your diet and the state of your body definitely affects your HRV metrics and what your HRV looks like. And because of the way that your blood vessels work and how diet affects them, I think a good rule of thumb, if you want to eat in a way that helps strengthen your HRV or your HRV-B practice, you would think about crunchy, colorful, and couldn't think of the third C, micronutrient rich. So foods that are crunchy, colorful, micronutrient rich, a lot of things you would put in a fresh salad, but you can also stir fry them. Getting your deep greens and your deep oranges and your deep purples, those are going to be the kinds of foods that have the nutrients that help you have really healthy looking blood vessels, basically, and good HRV. And I think it's important to focus on the do's instead of just the don'ts. So here it's like, do, well, okay, I am going to eat this colorful salad first, and then I'll eat, whatever else I need, but I'm going to make sure that I get that do in there as a part of health. All right. So that's kind of a whole picture of some different aspects of HRV-B, and let's go to the Q&A session. Mayu, I think you have a list of questions.
Hello. Definitely. There are a lot of questions that have come in. People are definitely interested in this topic, and also the chat has been very hot about feedback and about questions. So let's try to go through as many as we can. And then I really hope that we'll have a follow-up webinar for this to answer more questions. Okay, but there are some of these I'm trying to group these together because people have very similar questions. So one is, the first one would go that are bigger waves equal to higher HRV equal to higher resonance score?
Yeah, so I'd say bigger waves are equal to a higher resonance score. HRV, I really think of as this umbrella concept that, your heart doesn't beat in this regular fashion like a metronome. There's a lot of variability. But when people say they measured HRV, they picked one mathematical formula. And the truth is there's like 10, 20 different mathematical formulas that you can apply for different aspects of HRV-B. I hope that kind of makes sense. Resonance was B, one of them, and that's the one that we care the most about during HRV-B.
Perfect. And then one very often question that was asked very often is that about the personal resonance zone that people have. So I'm just going to ask this one question, that does breathing at a different, slower rate negatively impact my HRV-B practice's effectiveness?
Yeah.
And yeah, then there's a lot of questions about how do you find your personal resonant frequency, and is everybody's breathing frequency different? So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'll call it the pace, like the pace that you breathe at. And currently we basically offer just one pace, but there are other apps like the Inner Balance app that allow you to change the pace. And so when I went and did my HRV certification, some of the leading teachers in the field really believe that there is like a best resonant frequency for each person. And so they, if you see them in their office, will have you breathe at some different paces, some a little bit faster and some a little bit slower than what Meru uses. When I first started doing it, I was kind of skeptical that the pace really mattered. And I did some kind of researchy stuff to to test their theory. And I saw some evidence that I was like, I'm not totally convinced that the pace is really important. However, then I will say that we added a question to the app about whether you're comfortable with the pace. You know, do you feel the pace is right for you? Do you feel like it's too fast or too slow? And I just looked at that, and basically you all have now taught me that pace really does matter. So I can see that the people who feel more comfortable with the pace are getting, you know, a bigger waveform. And they also seem to have, that seems to translate into some better outcomes too. So now that I've seen that, I really do think that we need to work to help people find the right pace. And, you know, if you feel like Meru's pace isn't optimal for you, you can also use the same device with the Inner Balance app that HeartMath makes, and they will let you change the pace. I think finding the right pace, you just have to try different ones and then look at their, they call it coherence. It's a little bit different than resonance, but it's kind of the same thing, same idea.
Thank you. And then there's also a lot of questions about the HRV-B data on the app. So there was a really good question about getting like a summary or the results of the HRV biofeedback session, that they're just getting, they're just getting a summary, but it just says slow resonance, 10 seconds, optimal resonance for minutes, 50 seconds. So it's not much of a data. So is there a way to access more of the HRV data?
So maybe you all can give me some feedback about whether you think this would be an important improvement. What I've been wanting us to do, you know, we can show trends of your metrics like your resonance score or your RMSSD, our HRV score for your resting data. We could show you the trends of that in the app. And that's one thing we've talked a lot about. But I think just seeing the numbers can be kind of confusing because you want to know what they mean. And, you know, if your score suddenly goes up and then goes down, you want to know why. And so what's complicated is that HRV, especially your resting scores, this is a little less true with your biofeedback, but with your resting scores, they're really affected by other things that affect your heart in big ways, right? It's not only our emotions that affect our heart. Like if we've just exercised, that has a huge effect on our heart. And so the day after you do a lot of hard cardio, you may see a day later that your HRV is low, and that's kind of an indication your body's not fully recovered yet from the, you know, the good stress of exercise, right? And also, you know, how much water, if you're dehydrated, your blood doesn't flow through your veins in the same way. So you want to be not dehydrated, and then you don't want to just chug like a gallon of water. Also illness. So anytime I'm sick, usually my HRV will go down for a while, sometimes even before I realize I'm sick. Yeah, so there's just different influences, and we can show the numbers in the app, but we run into the problem where participants think that their numbers should only go up, and that's just actually not true. Like your numbers will go up and down because of a lot of the other things that affect your heart in your life. And usually with resonance, the numbers don't keep going up. You kind of get up to a pretty good place, and then you kind of stay there. And from there, you can maybe go up or down a little bit.
Perfect. And I see a lot of comments in the chat that people would love more data.
More data. Well, tell
more
me,
data, please.
So I think there's this belief that people don't actually care so much about their data, but I don't know if that's true.
At least from this data set of Meru grads participants in this webinar, it's showing that data is needed.
So, are there questions?
Yes, there are more questions. One question is also about that. Could you practice HRV-B, for example, while walking, Or
Mm,
is there like, if you're wearing your HRV-B when you're not
yeah.
practicing, could you actually tell that you're being stressed?
Um, so you can't really practice it while you're walking, because like movement will distort the signal. So then you won't get a good readout. So unfortunately, you should be sitting. Also, when you lay down, your whole heart and blood pressure system work a little bit differently when you're lying down than when you're sitting up. And so the best posture for HRV is just sitting. And sorry, what was the other question?
So the other question was, wow, going through. Right. If we were wearing our HRV-B device when not practicing, could we see our heart rhythm when stressed? Does that make sense?
If you wear it when you're not practicing?
Yes. Could you kind of tell when your body is getting stressed if you're not practicing, if you
Mm.
just wear it like every day, basically?
You know, stress can like show up in a lot of different ways. I would say that what I can definitely see if I'm like recording data and doing little experiments, um, I can see like if I even just add like a mental stressor while I'm trying to keep breathing while doing something else, like multitasking, that causes a lot of like mental load for me. I'll see that my heart rate will kind of go up, and sometimes the waveform will get a little jaggedy. So even these kind of light stressors, they do seem to have the short-term effects. But if you just, if we just gave you back a measure of HRV every day, from like a resting assessment, I don't have really high confidence that that's going to map onto how stressed you feel, because the way you feel, it's just a combination of so many different things happening in your body that unfortunately it's not so simple as just measuring this one thing every day.
That makes a lot of sense. And one more comment for the data that a lot of people are also saying is that not just providing data, but actually providing how to use that data, how to feel better with that data. So it's
I,
excellent feedback from everyone.
one thing, I'll tell you anecdotally, one thing I did that really started to convince me was there was this one day where my two kids wanted to be in the bathtub together for fun, just they were playing. So I let them be in the bathtub, and one is, younger than the other one by about 5 years. So sometimes I worry about the older one being able to hurt the younger one accidentally just because they're bigger. So I was sitting outside, letting them play and just trying to monitor them and make sure the little one didn't get hurt. And I was doing biofeedback, and I was doing fine. And then they started playing rougher, and I could hear them getting louder, and I could see that my resonance was pretty bad. It pretty much disappeared, because evidently one of the things that stresses me out the most is when I'm worried about my children. And so then I had to take the little one out of the bath, but I let the big one stay in, got the little one settled, and did HRV-B again, and I was back to normal. And so when it comes to learning about yourself, I think even trying those experiments with yourself and noticing how, like, what you're doing from day to day and then how it seems to affect you, I think that's just a powerful learning tool.
That's an excellent example. Hey, I know we're at the top of the hour, but I want to ask one more question, which also seems to pop up often, which is that people are matching the breathing, but still can't get into deep resonance. What can they do?
Yeah, so I think if you're doing the breathing at the right pace and the app is telling you you're in low resonance, the most likely thing is that your resonance goes way down as you get older. And so starting about in your 40s, your resonance starts dropping, and then it drops quite a bit every decade after. And sorry to say, I'm already on the declining side of that. And there's not too much you can do about it, but I think it's actually one of the things I think continuing the practice, it's kind of like exercising, like it helps with healthy aging. It's a way to think about it. So if you're not getting into resonance, it could be that the current version of the app is not really tuned to people over 40. And that's one of the improvements we're trying to make right now. But it's challenging to personalize the algorithm.
Thank you so much, Kirstin. This has been an excellent presentation. And for all of you whose questions didn't get answered, I would recommend following us on our social media and also subscribing to our Meru Graduates newsletter, so you will get all the information when we do have more information coming out from HRV-B. So you will get to learn more. And for all the practical questions that you have, please connect with our care coordination support@meruhealth.com, and they will help you support@meruhealth.com, and they will help you with all the connectivity issues and all the practical side with your HRV-B.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope we're going to capture all the chats so we can look back through them later.
Thank you, everyone.